We're going to get started right away because I have an intro to Kris and there's a lot to say. I'm Kiki Kosnick, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our next presenter, who is a trailblazing activist, teacher, scholar, a tirelessly caring human being, and a friend to many of us, Dr. Kris Knisely. Kris Knisely holds a PhD in French and Educational Studies from Emory University and is currently Associate Professor of French and Intercultural Competence, tenured at the University of Arizona. In Kris's own beautiful words, Kris's research, quote, considers gender and sexuality in the linguistic, sociocultural, and instructional dimensions of language learning. This entails asking how the linguistically and culturally situated ways that we perceive and embody gender into language enter into language education, what normativities manifest there, and how those normativities can be laid bare, upended, and unscripted by language teachers and learners, end quote. So the topic of today's conference. In Kris's work, the language classroom is a site of care, connection, and transformation, political, personal, linguistic, and cultural. As a prolific author and creator of open educational resources, Kris is a leading voice not only in trans and queer linguistics, gender just language pedagogy, and critical cultural studies, but also in the field of language education in the most capacious sense. Kris's work has appeared in some 20-ish different journals and edited volumes, including Contemporary French Civilization, Critical Multilingualism Studies, Foreign Language Annals, Gender and Language, and the Modern Language Journal. Kris is also co-editor of Redoing Linguistic Worlds on Making Gender Binaries, Remaking Gender Pluralities. As Kris mentioned in the chat earlier, a follow-up volume is on the horizon, and you can still reach out to Kris about that. In addition, Kris is currently working on a collaborative multi-language collection of open educational resources for gender just language education. Many of us kindred folks whom Kris and others are shepherding on the platform Zulip are here today. Materials produced will be shared via Kris's website, which we probably all have bookmarked, www.krisknisely.com, under the tab Resources for Educators, which already houses an abundance of invaluable materials. I'm now going to turn things over to Kris, our beloved colleague and friend, who will lead us through the workshop, Doing Gender Justice in Language Education, Open Access Materials, and Coalitional Efforts. This will be followed by some discussion time, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat as well. So thank you so much, Kris.
Thank you, Kiki. What a warm welcome. How do I even properly thank you for that? Yeah, I appreciate you all for having me here today, and I appreciate your flattery and also your kindred work, Kiki. If people don't know, Kiki does great stuff, so go read Kiki's stuff too. But let me not get lost in the warm fuzzies as much as I would like to. Um, while we get started, I also kind of want to know a little bit about who you all are today. And so, with some great help from our technical wonder person, you'll see a poll pop up. I want to know, what languages do you teach? And if you teach a lot of them, I'm sorry, pick one. It's a little messy. And if I didn't include your language because I didn't recognize the language that you teach at the very first session today when we were brainstorming a starting list, please go ahead and type that in there. So I'll pull that to the side. You all can see. Looks like we've got a healthy group. I will trust my handy dandy technological support here to eventually make us some working groups where we won't be alone, hopefully, in our languages, and if we are, we'll fix that. So, what's my two-part plan for today? First, I'm going to do the quickest overview I possibly can about why gender matters in language education, why gender justice has to be about more than inclusion alone, and why it requires our coalitional efforts. Essentially, this is a quick and dirty overview of my forthcoming publication on gender just pedagogies in the open access Introduction to Applied Linguistics for Language Educators, of which you will find a copy at that handy dandy link. For some of you here, this is going to be really old hat. For other people here, it might be really overwhelming. So there are a few sort of 101 type resources that you can also pull up to sort of figure out what in the world is this person talking about. Um, yes, hopefully what this will do is give us a sort of shared ground to work with in the second part of our time together, where what I want us really to do is to think about how using languaging data can help us do gender just work with our students in language classes, which very conveniently was set up by Kirby's first talk this morning. So without further ado, let's jump right in, because the best time we'll have is the time when we get to talk to each other at the end. Um, what does it mean for uh, language education to be a social and relational act, bound up with our social doings, including gender? And how does that understanding of what language education is fly in the face of many of the well-intentioned but problematic stances that we encounter as language educators in our field that is de facto cisnormative, and in a field that exists in a world that's wildly trans antagonistic? I'm shocking no one with that, I am sure. Uh, there we go, clicking away. Oh, and you probably want to be able to see things. Let me put things in corners. So to help us dig in, let's consider what one language educator once said to me: I treat everyone the same. Their gender doesn't matter. I just teach the language. This is a pretty common and often well-intentioned approach to gender and language education. It's also a manifestation of multiple interconnected misunderstandings, ones that gloss over the interconnections among gender, language, and learning, and really miss the social relational nature of these phenomena. Let's use this utterance as a way to break down what we might be missing in approaches like this and start to imagine alternatives. So, the suggestion that gender doesn't matter in language education ignores the social turn in applied linguistics. It ignores everything we know about how who we are, our positions in society, and our relationships to one another all influence the way that we do language, the way we relate to language, and the way that other people perceive those doings. It also influences the choices that or the ways that we interpret the choices that other people make in language. So when I'm teaching about language and gender in my introductory and gen ed courses, I usually like to bring in sociopragmatics. That's language and interaction as influenced by our perceived sociocultural norms, and have students think about how the meaning of some given utterances could be influenced by who produced it, their relationship to you, and the context in which it's expressed. So let's go ahead and do that like super quickly for three utterances here, taking absolutely for granted everyone's genders in this equation because we have to have some constants. So let's start with the idea of hey baby. When I hear "Hey baby" from an elderly Black woman that I see every weekend at the grocery store, that's a really warm and very different "Hey baby" from the same utterance that I might hear from a stranger in the produce section on a Saturday morning who I assume to be a man my age. And that's also different than when the non-binary barista who I say hello to every time I go to the coffee shop says "Hey baby" to me. These are also very different from a "Hey baby" from a man I don't know in a dark alleyway, or from someone I think is a woman in the same context. So what all of this quickly starts to show us is that the same words uttered in different contexts by people of different genders with whom I have a different relationship evoke very different meanings. Looking at this second utterance, "Il est belle," or "he's pretty," this defies cis heteronormative assumptions because il or he tend to be understood as gesturing towards masculinity, and belle and pretty tend to be understood as gesturing towards femininity. Who produced this utterance and who it refers to will both influence how we're likely to interpret it. If the person uttering this phrase is learning to language in French or English, will imagine that it was a mistake in constructing il est beau or he's handsome or elle est belle, she's pretty. Why? Because we'll have cisnormative assumptions about the reference gender as likely a man or a woman and their sexuality as heterosexual, whether or not any of that is actually true. Which of these gets assumed to be correct is also going to vary based on a reading of the gender and sexuality of the person who produced the utterance. Who am I assuming that utterance producer will find attractive? And then assumptions about the utterance producer and reference gender modalities might also enter into consideration, right? If I'm assuming that people involved are cis, it's going to decrease the likelihood
Yeah.
that I'm thinking about translingual cultures.
Hello.
If a mistake isn't assumed, then we might end up interpreting this as an insult to the gender of the referent, especially if that person is read as a cis man, or maybe as an indication of the referent's queerness. I love Kirby, who writes about how sometimes pronouns are just something you wear to the gay party. Go read their Medium blog posts and enjoy everything about that. So those first two utterances help us start to really concretely see how language and gender get interconnected. And then this third utterance here lets us get even more into the weeds to really lean into reflecting upon what happens when ways of doing gender can't be neatly categorized into traditional binary noun classes or other systems that we have in our languages, like French, Spanish, so many others, right? An utterance like "Il est bello, gentil comme tout, et une personne super intelligente" adds a whole new layer to these considerations of this interlocutor utterance producer relationship. So, again, depending on the positionalities of these people, we might think that this is all a mistake. Or maybe we're going to say, oh, yeah, that's trans people doing translinguistic practices. Got it. Or we're going to just try not to notice, whether willfully or actually we didn't notice. But the point of this is that when we examine the ways that our social positions and those of our interlocutors influence how we do language and how our languaging is interpreted in interaction, we see that our genders do matter. And so do all of the other identities through which we're positioned in society. This process of examining how we do gender and language together also lays bare why we can't just teach the language, because there's no singular, pre-established, stable, decontextualized language to be taught. The possible interpretations of any given utterance are bound up with the context in which that languaging happens. Language exists in that moment, right? Not before it. Um, and the very shapes and pathways that our languaging might take also is bound up in context, particularly as they relate to who we are in connection to whom we're languaging with and how these relationships interact with our communicative ends and our prior language experiences. This is because language isn't a thing, right? Language doesn't exist a priori. It's not before us. It doesn't exist without us. It's something that we don't just simply take off the shelf and use as is in interactions, right? Language is always being reshaped in interaction. Language is an act that we do with others. And to the extent that each of us is engaged in doing language, we're all actively a part of this ongoing and continuous change. This is why you'll hear me do my best to always situate language as a verb, because languagers aren't simply passive users of pre-established inherited systems that get forced upon them, right? People are agentive participants in the continuous recreation of in-language reality, including learners. Learners are languagers and languagers are learners. Anyways, we'll get back to that. So what we're doing when we challenge previously existing enlanguagements is transgressing so-called rules of languaging but it's also opening up new ideas and realities, making space for bigger ideational worlds, right? We're not only challenging what was in language, but we're remaking everyone's linguistic experience and what we might understand as possible. The big thing here is if we language differently from one another, it's largely because we create and take up varying identities, occupy different social locations, and have different relationships to one another and to linguistic acts. All of this always changing across time and context. If we're not the same and we don't experience the world the same way, treating everyone the same fails to honor the differences in what we need to be successful as languagers and learners, and not only. What all of this implies is that if we want to work towards languaging and language education that's more equitable and just, we as languagers, scholar educators, and students have to do more than include everyone in existing harmful systems. We have to participate in remaking these systems with and alongside the people who are invested in and affected by them, so that they and the processes, products, and perspectives bound up in them are increasingly equitable and just for everyone. If I'm spending so much time talking about what is language, it's because this key assertion of language as verb, to my mind, really allows us to understand and unscript a cislingual relationship to language that suggests any sort of rigid limitations on how people can do language, do gender, and do them together. For me, it unlocks our ability to think and teach language with trans epistemologies at the center of what we do. What do I mean? You might have heard somebody say that French or Spanish or whatever language you know only has a masculine or feminine form. But that's patently false. They don't have anything because language isn't a thing capable of possessing or not possessing particular forms or qualities. Language is not capable of doing or not doing a particular function. It's a multimodal, whole-bodied action that we engage in. We're not restricted to the oral modality of speakers, and we certainly don't have the stakeless passivity of users. Language is something that's dependent upon and emerges within human-to-human interaction. It's a process by which we create our worlds. It's a verb, a whole-bodied, equitative, and purposeful act. And in languaging is that patterned outcome of these communicative processes. We render real by rendering linguistic. What we identify as language is our collective memories of what is possible in language and what we might do going forward. So if non-binary people are in languaging their worlds with yel or eye or any other thing that you can think of, so many options, and we are, then these ways of doing language exist. It's cislingualism that would suggest otherwise, using this anthropomorphization of language as thing to justify and enforce in language binarism. Cislingualism is the valuing of cisnormative cultures of language and the ideologies that inflect them. It's this compulsion to perform on the normatively here side of language, rather than in the there, wayward, unhygienic, excessive, translingual, or disorderly languaging. Translingual cultures, that is, these cultures of language that defy borders and binaries, and the notion of language and verb are direct challenges to cislingualism. There's no pre-established and decontextualized system that is used just is. Language is constantly reshaped in interaction because language is interaction. This means that there's not one correct form of language. Language isn't static. It can't deteriorate, be harmed, or be desecrated. People love to suggest that we're ruining language, but that's simply not possible. It also means that canonically named languages are artificial boundaries, right? We have these ideologies of monolingualism, but people engage their full linguistic repertoires and in language and communicate their realities however they can make that happen. So we trouble the tidiness of these distinctions among named languages and the sort of constructed naturalness of borders between languages when we're engaged in things like translanguaging. All of this also means that claims to linguistic authority are at odds with how language actually functions, whether that operates by prescribing how language should be or by pretending that there's ever the possibility of some sort of objective truth and neutrality when we talk about language, right? Because some academy says that non-binary ways of languaging don't exist, that doesn't make people suddenly not do language in those ways. What it does is it reifies marginalization, and it lays bare just how cis-sexist and neocolonial the people making those utterances are. But by the time they've taken enough time to notice and start fighting about how we stop that from happening, language change in progress is already here. It already was here. We can get into how people love to argue that inclusive ways of doing language, more expansive ways of doing language, render language inaccessible and impossible to learn, despite all scientific evidence to the contrary. But let's leave that for another point. So, a lot of this might be really like banal statements, but they directly respond to and counter the kinds of ways that cis heterosexism gets brought into language and into our classrooms. And it really pushes back against the ways that we use language attitudes as woefully tolerated ways to ensmall trans people. So this cislingual logic that there's some sort of stable, decontextualized way of doing language fuels symbolic violence, sort of taking it back to the opening statements and others that I regularly observe language educators express. In short, rendering cislingual cultures as unmarked, as taught and treated to be the model for language, to the exclusion of translingual cultures, is sort of what we're trying to upend here. I want to roll faster than I'm rolling, so we're going to do this as quick and dirty as I possibly can. What does it mean to unscript cislingualism in language education? Well, first, teaching direct and indirect non-binary languaging, right? Language forms have to be there, but also bringing in translanguaging, trans multilingualisms, which involves not only unsettling the ideas of doing language and gender, but also ideas about visibility and invisibility, knowability, linguistic authority, individual agency, and the ways that fuller linguocultural participation is taught and learned. See, once we start pulling at one thread, a lot of our sort of a prioris and attitudes start to fall apart. How can we do this? One of the things that we can do is be clear on everything that translingual cultures can teach us. I'm going to skip going over the research for today. They have a lovely little infographic. Check it out or chat with me. We can talk about it in the time we have together. So one of the sort of core sets of ways that this happens is through forms of gender just pedagogies. These are always multiple because like it would be the most unqueer, untrans thing to do to say there is only one right way to move us towards gender justice, right? A lot of things that do happen is commit to unearthing and questioning all forms of normativity, bring in queer and trans people, lives, lingual cultures, create space for marginalized perspective, and always attend to and respect individual agency and a right to self-definition. All of this involves a focus on respectful engagement and leaving room for fluidity, flexibility, and complexity. There are so many ways that these aims can get taken up, but the really key thing is we're investing in people who defy cisnormativities, and we are divesting from the practices and perspectives that harm people who don't play with cisnormativity as well. So what can we do? We can explore with and alongside our students. We can get rid of this idea that we have to be the expert in all things trans and queer in order to do something meaningful. That's just patently not true, right? And instead, do things like go out and get data with students, do studies with students, be transparent with students about what you do and don't know, and sort of do that collaborative research together. And that's great because that helps sort of decenter power in the classroom. We also want to find space throughout the curriculum to desensationalize and create value around queer and trans discussions, situating this as a part of critical literacy, right? Rather than reifying the marginalization by relegating queer and trans knowledges to isolated days, units, or courses. We can engage in critical close reading and discussion, right? Asking restive, problematizing questions. What is the status quo? Why is it that way? Who benefits from that? Who's marginalized by it, etc. And then we also want to tie queer and trans content directly to learning goals. Um, I often joke with people that it's shocking how much of the time that I spend discussing with people amounts to do it from the very beginning, do it wherever it can come up, and try not to make it weird. Um, so that brings us to the part of our time together today that I hope will be most meaningful because it's a chance to talk together. So having this sort of shared sense of what is language, what is gender justice in its broadest strokes, I want to have you go to that website, krisknisely.com/IALLE, and click on the preprint so that you can scroll down to pages 8 through 11 and see exercises 1 and 2. I'm going to open up breakout rooms with the help of our handy dandy technological assistants today in order for you to be able to get with people who are hopefully working on your same language or at least in a similar language family where your discussions can sort of work across your specific realities. And you all decide what makes sense and what is useful. What I have here is a first exercise with some questions that follow, where you get to look at some examples of direct and indirect non-binary languaging. So direct non-binary languaging, where the forms and structures give you a really high likelihood that we're talking about someone who's non-binary, or indirect, where we're sort of using pseudo-normative ways of languaging to make space in a language, but it could refer to someone of sort of any gender or gender modality. And then the second exercise is really about thinking about how would you take data like this, or how would you gather data if you don't have the data at the ready with your students? What kind of exercises might you do in a gender just framework to make meaningful conversations and learning happen? And sort of what questions do you have around that? I think we have about a half hour if I get to steal the 10 minutes. I'm not sure. We have 20 to 30 minutes. I'll find out exactly how much. So I'm going to give you maybe 10 to 15 altogether, and then hopefully come back for just a little debrief about what we got out of them, out of these groups, and what questions we might still have to go.